Hello guys, as part of our interacting with databases in Mule for tutorial series, in this video we are going to see how to fetch data from more than one source, particularly from MySQL and Postgres, but we can scale it out and use it to fetch data even from more than two sources. So in the previous tutorial we saw how to insert data to a database and also update rows and also delete rows. Before that, in part 2 we saw about on getting data using RI parameters, query parameters and headers, and now we are going to get data, we are going to fetch data from MySQL and Postgres. Let's say some part of the data that you want resides in MySQL and the other part in Postgres, or it could be even somewhere in S3 in the cloud, in AWS S3, some part of it, the rest in MongoDB, the rest in Redshift, and so on. So using the Scattergather, we can get the data. This is like a parallel operation. So if we can run it in parallel, I mean, if it doesn't need sequential operations, if the output of one of them is not an input for the other one, then we can use Scattergather. So what Scattergather does is, if we see the documentation of MuleSoft, here it says Scattergather sends a request message to multiple targets concurrently. So it collects the response from all routers and aggregates them into a single message. So we are going to see. So we are going to send select statements to Postgres and MySQL, Postgres and MySQL, right? And then it is going to give us a single response, and we are going to transform that single response and display the output. So let's go to Anypoint Studio. Here I will create a Mule project. Let's call it Scattergather. Finish. So in the previous tutorials we have been interacting with the tables that we inserted. So we created this Northwind database, and there are a couple of tables under it, and we have inserted it to both MySQL and Workbench. So if you want to experiment with data, learn from it by practicing, then you can watch, I think, the first video of the interacting with databases tutorial series, and it shows where we got the data from. You have to run some script to create this database and all the tables. So for now, let's assume I have the data in MySQL and also in Postgres, but let's assume some part of the data is in Postgres and some part of the data is in MySQL. So what are the tables we have? To show you the tables, the different tables. These are the different tables we have. So let's say, for example, we see employee and employee territory are here. So what column do we have under employee territory? We have employee ID and territory ID, whereas under employee we have employee ID and so on, all these columns. So we see they have a common column. This is the employee ID is an ID, so we can, for the employees, we can get the corresponding employee territory for them by combining these two tables. So we can get, let's say, this table, it doesn't exist in MySQL, so we'll get it from Workbench. I mean, we'll get it from Postgres, whereas this one, we are going to get it from MySQL. So we go here. The first thing is, as always, from the HTTP module, we drag and drop a listener, and have to specify configuration. The default configuration with this port is fine. And the path, let's call it employee, and let's use the URI parameters now. In the previous tutorials we have seen how to use URI parameters, query parameters, and headers. We know how to interact with all of them, how to access them. Now just let's use only URI parameters here. So let's call this employee ID. So okay, then after we are done with this, we go to Scattergather, drop it here, and then we go to databases module, and from database module we want select statement, so we drop it here twice. I'm choosing the latest version. Another one, just drop it here, and once it shows this black line, drop it there. I should have two of them. Select here, yeah. So now I will connect one of them to Postgres and one of them to MySQL. Let's connect this to MySQL. So employee data from MySQL, and the connection, it should be, so in the previous tutorials we showed that how to do the connection. So we specify the connection type, MySQL connection. We specify here also required libraries. We can simply click this add Maven dependency and click finish. For MySQL it is fine. Then we specify the host, local host, the port is 3306, user is root, and the database we created is Northwind. So I come here and Northwind, and my tutorial password is this one. Come here and paste it here and test the connection. Okay, connection successful. Next, let's connect Postgres. So to connect Postgres, let's first the display name, let's call it. So we said we'll get employee from MySQL, and we are assuming employee territory is in Postgres. So this one, let's call it employee territory from Postgres, and specify connection parameters. Here there is no Postgres, so we just select generic connection, and we have to add the Maven dependency here for Postgres. Add Maven dependency. Just delete this and go online and type Postgres Maven dependency. So this is from here. I took this one and it works fine, so paste it here, finish. Now I need to specify the URL and the driver class. We have added, I showed in the previous tutorials how to do that, but I have it here. I can just copy paste from here. This should be the URL, I mean the URL for Postgres. The file, this is the database name, so I have to change this to Northwind. Driver class, so the URL and the driver class, I will add them in the description section, and you can copy paste them from there. So this is my driver class. Name is Postgres, and password is the same thing. I have the same password, the same tutorial password for both of them. So copy this and paste it here. Test connection. Okay, post. Oh yeah, the other problem I noticed here is in Postgres Northwind is uppercase, so that could be the reason. Here I have the database name as Northwind uppercase N, so change this to N, and test connection. I guess this should work now. Okay, perfect. So this works. Now let's get from MySQL we will get employee information. So the SQL code for that will be select star from I guess employee where employee ID is what we are going to pass in the URI params. So let's call it employee ID, and the value of employee ID we specify it here. So employee ID is attributes dot URI params dot employee ID. So this is how we specify it. And in here in Postgres, rather than from employee, we are getting it from this other table. So for Postgres, let's see, we will get not employee data but rather employee territory. So this is a column name employee territory, and it has two columns, employee ID and territory ID. So just go here and change this to employee territory or employee territory, whereas the input parameter will be the same for both of them. So I just can copy this and paste it here and change this to an expression. So we are getting data from MySQL. We are getting employee data based on the employee ID, and the employee ID we are going to pass it as a URI param. And from Postgres we are getting employee territory, so we are going to join both of them. That means, so now let's add a transformer. We said in here it says it collects the responses from all routers and aggregates them into a single message. So let us see how we can transform that single message. So we go to core and transform message. Then here let's change this. We want it to JSON. We want to change it to JSON, and let's just put payload. So I want to show you what it looks like here. Let's add a breakpoint here and run this as a debug mode to see how we can access the data coming from the first route and versus the second route. So okay, employee ID, okay, employee. So if I run this in debug mode, once it completes, then we are going to submit from here. I'm using Arc or Advanced REST client, but you can use Postman also, but the same. So we are going to submit this. So employee is path and the URI param is for ID1, for example. I'll just submit this and we are going to debug it and see what's the output in each stage looks like. Okay, if I go to console, it seems this is ready. Now let me submit this. If I submit it and get back to here, okay, did I start it? Okay, it just deployed now. Submit. Okay, just come here. So as you can see, if we come here, it has got to here, and we can see the payload, what it looks like. So it has two keys, 0 and 1. So to access the output from the first one, we use payload.0 as a string, and the second one, to access the second one, we use payload.1. So let me show you what it looks like. This evaluate data with expression window. If we do payload.0 and just evaluate this, it gives us the data for, okay, I think this is in Java format, but this is information for okay, what is it? Clear. Okay, let me resubmit this again. Here, payload dot for the first one, since it has less number of columns, it has just only 2. If I do this dot payload, I have to do dot payload again, evaluate. So we see size 2, and what are they? I see territory ID and employee ID. So there are 2 values actually for this one. We see the 0. If we just add here also for the first values, okay, and this I see 0 and 1, and I see territory ID and the employee ID. So right here, if we do employee ID, what do we get? So under employee ID, we have 2 employee IDs. For both of them, the employee ID is 1. This shows there are a couple of records. There are 2 records with that. And if we do employee territory also, it should give us evaluate. Okay, employee territory. Territory ID. Territory ID. If we run this, the territory ID we see for the first one is for this one is 19,713, whereas for this one is 06897. So if I do this, it returns these 2 territory IDs. So for one employee ID, we can get more than 1 records, is what this is showing. But to access the data, the payload, we use payload.0, payload.1, and then when we do payload.0, that is a payload coming from the first route, then we add dot payload to that to access the payload of that. And then if we do dot of the fields we have, then we can access the respective column values. So in the transform message, we come here. What we can do here is in the transform message, let's transform our data. Click here. We say this one we want it to be in JSON, and we want to combine both of them. So what we can do is, if we go here, let's get the columns of employee first. So these are the columns. I'll just copy them, copy name. So I can go here and paste it here. So these are the different names, and I will make every one of them a new line. See, these are the columns coming from the first payload. Okay, what is this notice? These are the columns coming from the first payload. The same way, let's get the columns from the second payload are from employee territory are these two. So I just need one of them because employee ID is common, so I have copied it already. So go here and drop it here. So here in Notepad++, I can just click this and press and hold Alt and then the down arrow, or the, I think, let me check. Yeah, it is mouse, I guess, to just remove these columns. Yeah, like this. I can remove them like this. Select them, all of them at once, and just delete them. And this quote kind of comma, I can replace all of them by at once, replace by payload.0.payload. So if I do this, that means all of these columns except the first one, except the last one, come from the first payload. So payload.0.payload corresponds to the payload coming from the first, from MySQL in this case. So do like that, and I can copy paste this here. Actually, I should add this one when I replace it. I should add a comma also. Replace, add comma here, replace all, and copy this and dump it, paste it here as well, and paste it here as well. But territory ID comes from the second one, so I change this to 1. Then the next thing is employee ID. Oh, sorry, I didn't do this the right way. Okay, so replace here, I should add rather colon space like this. Okay, no, I should replace this part by this one, colon payload.0.payload with comma. Okay, so now this one I will paste it here. I will paste it here. I will paste it here as well, and remove this comma because it is the end. Then here I have to add employee ID dot employee ID. Last name is payload of 0.payload dot last name. First name is payload of 0.payload dot first name. Title the same way, dot title of courtesy the same way here. Birth date is payload of 0.payload of 0, and hire date the same way. That's how we access corresponding values for each one of them. CD, come here, and region, dot mobile dot email dot photo dot notice dot some id dot photograph photo path. Then this one, the last one, is payload of one dot payload dot territory id. So this is how we transform and get data from both databases in this case. So we come and put this in curly braces and paste it here. So this one, let's see. So let's check for employee ID 1, for example. These are unique, as you can see. From the employees, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But in the employee territory, I think there could be duplicators. So employee ID can correspond to these two territory IDs. So the territory ID will be like come back as an array here, but we have combined them. So when we request employee information and employee territory for a given employee ID, we will get all the employee information from the employee table and their corresponding territory ID values, which could be one or more. Okay, so now we have saved this. We'll see in debug mode still what it looks like. Let's add a logger here. Remove this breakpoint, and I will add a logger, another logger here, and add a breakpoint here. Now let's make sure this is saved. Perfect. So once this reruns, we are going to debug it the same way and see if our transformation is correct. Type, I think it was territory ID. That should be an array. Yeah, this one we have not extracted it because we saw there could be one person could live in different places, so it could be duplicated. So here, I mean, there could be multiple. One employee ID could match to a couple of territory IDs. So if we do like this, this should return an array, two values. So we have, you see, territory ID is this one, employee ID is this, and territory ID of this one, and employee ID is this. So let's remove this employee ID. We just need only the territory IDs. How do we do that? So here we are accessing the payload. This first payload comes from Scattergather, and we are accessing it by using .1 because it's the second one, and then .payload should gives us a payload. But from this payload we need only yeah, I have to specify the column name actually here. This one I should put it here. I don't know why I forgot it. Okay, so to create an array of the territory ID, we just do payload of one, as you can see at the bottom here, at the bottom of the screen, territory ID payload dot one. It will give us the output from Postgres. Then we do dot payload again to get the payload, and when we add dot territory ID, it is going to create an array of the territory ID. So now we are combining the data from the two databases and returning a JSON file. I have also added a logger here with the message success. So I have deployed this project. Let me see if it has completed deployment. Okay, so it is deployed. Now I can go here to clip this. I can come to arc and submit for any employee ID, like for employee ID 1, submit. So we see it returns employee ID, last name, first name, title, and so on, and territory ID now is an array. And if we go to workbench, for territory ID 1 we have two, for employee ID 1 we have two territory ID values. Those are the two values that we will return it. Same thing here, we can, if we put 2, so you see in this employee ID is associated with many territory IDs, and we can go to workbench and check. So 2, employee ID 2, as you can see, is associated with all these territory IDs, and that is what we saw here. That's what it shows here. So in this tutorial, okay, what did we do in this tutorial? So what we did in this tutorial is we used Scattergather and submitted requests to MySQL to get data from one table, and from Postgres another data based on employee ID, which is based on the RI parameters, and that returns a single message, a single payload, and we accessed the payloads from the first one and the second one appropriately, and we created, since a single employee can be associated with more than one territory IDs, we created territory ID array, whereas the rest of them are just extracted values. So that is what we did, and in the next tutorial we are going to see to use other kinds of operations.